Good afternoon and welcome to the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast, live from the Facebook, posted on the Facebook main page. My name is Andrew Kremen and I'm joined as always by Rory O'Connor.
Hey, how's it going?
And author of the book Democracy in Decline. James, welcome.
Welcome, guys. I apologize for shaving. It's obvious I should have a beard just based on what I'm looking at here.
No, I think you're fine. Now, before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about your background as a lawyer, as an academic, and as an author?
Yeah, I'm something of an outlier in the university world. Basically, I'm a conservative constitutional law and legal philosophy person. You could probably pick up the 2 or 3 conservative constitutional law profs in this country. We're not allowed to travel on the same plane together because it's too risky. But so I don't know how. I have a pretty unusual background. I did a university degree in mathematics because Canada has an American system. You can't do law right away. And then law, and then got married, moved to London to do a master's at the LSE. Came back and worked in a really big law firm, a sort of New York-sized Toronto law firm for a couple of years. Then I went to the bar in London for a year and a bit. And over lunch one day at Middle Temple, I got offered a job. Literally over lunch. They were starting a new law school in Hong Kong before the handover. And so I went home and my wife and I, we didn't even really know where Hong Kong was. We knew it was somewhere in China. So we looked it up and we thought, oh, we'll go for a year. We spent 4. It was magnificent. It was like living in sort of a Somerset mom sort of world, dinner jacket 2 or 3 times a week and always going out. And it was, 89 to 93, but it was a lotus life. So we moved to New Zealand and had 11 years there. And by the way, when all my lefty friends pretend how virtuous they are economically, I tell them that my wife and I, when we moved from Hong Kong to New Zealand, our joint income was 20% of what it had been in Hong Kong. I mean, there's more important things than money in life. And the problem with Hong Kong was, we had our first child coming along and it was a really bad place to bring up kids. They were sort of spoilt, rotten sort of little kids. So we moved to New Zealand. That was terrific. And then I got headhunted to come here 2005. So that's pretty much my basic guiding principle in life is to stay one step ahead of extradition.
So the next question is then, what exactly is the truckers' movement? How did these protests come about and what was the Trudeau government's response?
Well, I guess I should preface this by saying, I think 1 month after the lockdowns kicked out, I wrote my first thing in the Spectator blasting them. I have been a lockdown skeptic throughout. I can read data because I have a math degree. It never made sense to me. I've written something for some incredibly left-wing law journal, the Griffith Law and, I don't know what it is, one of those left-wing Griffith Law reviews, Law and Dignity or something. But when you looked at the data early on, it didn't really make any sense, this thing. Not many people know that in October 2019, the WHO and Britain had a how to deal with pandemic sort of book that was based on 100 years of data. And from December 2019 to February, they threw it all out the window in a month and a half based on, watching China weld people in their homes. And it's just remarkable. I mean, Lord Sumption, the retired UK judge, he said, what has happened in the democratic world is the biggest inroads on our civil liberties ever. And that, when in the Spectator this week, I have a piece coming out saying, and the entire human rights lobby that can rouse themselves into, paroxysms of indignation when one person claiming to be a refugee has to apply from offshore. They have said nothing about these. They have said nothing about the heavy-handed policing or the ridiculous lockdown rules or the fact we were the only country that wouldn't let its own citizens leave the country. And so it's against that background where some people have done incredibly well out of the lockdowns, like the laptop class, upper middle class. If you work for the ABC, billionaires have done incredibly well. The money they've pumped into the system, the inflation is not money inflation, it's asset inflation. So this has been the best 2 years for rich people. If you own assets, they've gone way up in value. The people who are poor, don't own assets, or had sort of jobs where some idiot bureaucrat or a politician just decided it wasn't an essential job, On what right they had, I do not know. And so they have been screwed over. And it's against that background where there's a lot of dissatisfaction. And I'm very sympathetic to the people who have been screwed over. If you point out to people that even before vaccines, the infection fatality rate never got above, your chances of survival were 99.7% plus, and that's across the board. If you were under 50, it was about 1 in 50,000 people who caught it died. And the people who have done the biggest sacrifice are people young, under 25, you people. Your chances of dying from COVID were close to zero. I know the press went out of their way to try to find the odd person. And of course, people die from the flu. But if you look up the statistics on young people, it was about the same as the flu. So you guys mask up worthless. There's 14 randomized controlled tests on masking, and none of them can show a statistical. It's all observational studies. Those used to be considered worthless. And it's against this sort of incredible illiberalism and despotism, which people endured for a year and a half. Partly, I think it's because none of us had any idea how feral the mainstream legacy press would be. Basically, it's coming out in Britain now that, they were in the game of nudging, which means scaring people witless. They had surveys in Britain where, a sizable chunk of respondents thought that if they caught COVID, their chances of dying were 33%. Try 0.02. And that's if the worst thing you can be is old. So in Australia, Britain, Canada, Australia, the average age of COVID deaths is higher than your life expectancy. Now just let that sink in. The people who were dying were very, very old. Nobody wants anyone to die. But, when you're making public policy, you have to consider people who will die because of the lockdowns. Again, there's a fair few eminent people who think that when you count up 10 years from now, the number of deaths caused by lockdowns, mental health, drinking, domestic violence, missed cancer checks, these are going to be they're going to dwarf the number of lives we saved with the lockdowns. Nobody talked about any of this stuff. All of the burden was put on basically the young and the poor. If you were a billionaire, you did great. If you were Bunnings, you did great. And so this idea of Morrison's that we're all in this together was one of the biggest lies I have ever heard. And so I've always been thinking this is just shockingly bad public policy. And I've been disappointed in Australian, the Australians have been incredibly sheep-like, if I can put it that way. Young people getting screwed over are the biggest sort of mask-wearing, let's follow the rules. And the question is, well, at some point, you can, H.L. Hart, the wonderful legal philosopher, said this best. At some point, morality is more important than law. And I don't have a problem with protesters. Now, they have to take their medicine. If you protest and you get an infringement notice or whatever, you have to, that's part of civil disobedience, is paying the fine. But some of these rules were brutal. We kept kids away from their dying parents. Some of these state premiers were shocking in my view. And Mr. Morrison and Frydenberg wrote a check for it all. They never criticized anyone. So the entire political class, quite shocking. What was even worse in Canada? I'm from Canada. Trudeau was even worse, except he didn't spend as much as Frydenberg. You guys will be paying back the debt the Liberal Party accumulated for your entire life. It is, nobody could have spent more than the Liberals. I personally believe that Labour would have spent less because they would have had an opposition screaming about how much they were spending. And so the dynamics of Frydenberg, no one was doing that. So, we're going to have a $2 trillion debt in about 3 years. That's on a level with the Americans. When Howard stepped down, there was no government debt at all. And I'm not paying this back because I'm going to be dead. And I've got the assets. I'm not paying it back. You guys don't have the assets. You will be paying it back. You should be outraged. Niall Ferguson, the historian, said anyone under 25 should be joining the Tea Party. You guys want to bring in, very strict economic policies. That's good for your long-term future, but it won't happen because the sort of boomer generation like me has really screwed you over. Anyway, this happens in Canada, and nothing happens for a long time. And then Prime Minister Trudeau, who is basically in an Olympic contest with the Prime Minister of New Zealand to see who can be the most woke right on, nauseating leader in the democratic world, and it's a hard call. You have to admit it. Photo finish between Prime Minister Ardern and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And Trudeau, I mean, let's be honest, he's not a very bright guy. His dad, Pierre Trudeau, was very bright. I didn't like Pierre Trudeau's politics. I thought they were awful. But his dad was really smart. So for those of us on the right side of politics, it's always an interesting question. When you're presented with a leader on the left, would you prefer him to be dumb or stupid? I used to always think dumb was better. You know, at least Justin Trudeau's got an IQ floating around 80. Maybe I was wrong about that. Who knows? But Trudeau, for some reason, decided that he was going to impose a vaccine mandate on the truckers. These are the people who kept working through the entire sort of thing at, if to the extent there was a risk, they faced it, not the laptop class. Something like 80 to 85% of these truckers were vaccinated. There was no need for him to impose this. I don't know how many of your listeners know, but there's no evidence that unvaccinated people spread the virus any more than vaccinated people. I'm double vaccinated because I just spent 2 months in Canada and London visiting my kids. And you can't get there. But, you know, I am appalled by the vaccine mandates. And I say that as a vaccinated person. What is the argument for a vaccine mandate? Well, one is, well, people who aren't vaccinated spread the disease more. But that's not true, which is why the vaccine mandates are collapsing. You know, like 7 or 8 countries in Europe have recently collapsed. And if I spent 8 years on a university ethics committee, and the idea then that you would actually force people to take a medical procedure was zero chance of that. And that's effectively what we're doing. Now, if we were living through the Black Plague in the 14th century, when 1/3 of people who caught it died, well, you would make a different cost-benefit analysis. Or if it was the Spanish flu, where the victims were young and the hit rate was, 10, 15% of people died, we are under 0.3%. And so if people are unvaccinated and they are spreading the disease at pretty much the same rate as the vaccinated, well, it's no skin off anyone else's nose. Leave them alone. You know, they're only hurting themselves if you believe vaccines are so fantastically efficacious. Now, they do seem to stop people from dying who are in the high age risk category. They don't really have any effect for young people because young people had zero chance of dying anyway. Literally, at one point, if you're under 20, your chances of dying by getting hit by lightning were about the same as COVID. Now, you know, the worst thing you can be with COVID is old and fat. If you're obese, you're in big trouble. I think it's still the case that people who die of COVID, they have at least 4, that the average is 4 comorbidities, you know, like lung disease, chemotherapy, obesity. They got 4 of them. You know, we have been sold this idea that this is an incredibly dangerous disease where everyone's equally at risk, and it's just not true. And against that background, for some weird reason, Trudeau decided to impose a vaccine mandate on these people who had worked all the way through the pandemic with all the heavy-handed rules. And again, almost 80 to 85% of them were double vaccinated. But all of them decided they'd had too much. They had this convoy. They ended up getting to Ottawa. I have an awful lot of sympathy for them. That makes, most people will say, oh, well, these. Now, in any time you have a protest with 10, 100,000 people, are there going to be crazies there? Of course there are. And when you have a press that has acted sort of like the Pravda of our day, who hate protests, love lockdowns, have been, in the business of fear porn, they are going to focus in on the 2 people with the Confederate flag or the one sort of Nazi. But nobody could look at this group of people and think those weren't a minuscule percentage. These were basically truckers. And then more and more people came out to support them. And they just basically shut down the capital, Ottawa, middle of the city. They made noise all night. Would it have been pleasant to live there? No. So you can understand, wanting to silence them a bit. But again, it's in the context of a Prime Minister, Trudeau, who, when there were the Black Lives Matter protests, went and took a knee and said, you have to let protesters go. He didn't try to stop them at all. Or, when he's pointing to what's happening in India, he says, we're here for the protesters, and he sort of condemns the Indian government. So he's a ginormous hypocrite. Now, if you are on the left side of politics, apparently pictures can emerge of you in blackface 3, 4, 5 times, and nothing happens to you, right? There's one set of rules for people who present themselves as progressive lefties and another set of rules for conservatives. But Trudeau was a complete and total hypocrite on protests. Some protests that he agreed with, he just let roll. If you were protesting as a Native Indian in Canada, there's all sorts of places where the Native Indians have shut down whole roads forever. That's fine by Trudeau. But his core constituency politically did not like these protests. Because my view, and I'm not the only one who has it, but I've been writing about this for a while, I think the political spectrum is realigning in the Anglosphere. So when I was growing up, rich people voted conservative. I'm generalizing, right? But the Rockefeller Republican types, rich people around that's not true anymore. The 100 wealthiest counties voted for Clinton and Biden. And Boris Johnson did not win the rich vote. They were all Remainers who would have walked over broken glass to get Boris Johnson out. The political spectrum is Trump sort of nailed the new coalition on the right. The new coalition is middle class, working class people who are I don't mean socially conservative in the sense that they don't like gay marriage or something. Who cares about that? They're socially conservative in the sense that they have a little bit of patriotism. They think their country is great. They recognize that this is one of the best cultures ever, and that these sort of people who are prepared to snipe at the edges of our culture, and of course every culture has flaws, they won't say anything about the Islamic world. They won't say anything about the million Uyghurs locked up in China. So they're hypocrites. And so they don't like the woke diversity sort of stuff. And that sort of coalition is the coalition, I think, that's going to win conservatives elections in the future. Trying to win inner city seats like Josh Frydenberg's coup, forget it. It's not going to happen in 10 years. The preferential voting system that we have has slowed it down. If you're in Canada or Britain or the US, first past the post voting, if I'm sickened by the total lack of commitment to values by Scott Morrison, I just go in the voting booth and I vote for, whatever the equivalent of liberal Democrats are. That's it. One tick and you go. And that kills the conservatives because they don't get my vote. We have a voting system, which I liked when I moved here, but I was wrong, which is effectively a protection racket for the two main parties. They'll never get rid of it. It forces you as a voter to pick between the two main parties, and so ultimately they'll get your vote. So you can be incredibly annoyed at the Liberal Party, and still most people will not preference Labour over the Libs. Now, back when Malcolm Turnbull orchestrated his coup, I advocated to actually preference Labour over the Libs, and I'm as conservative as anyone in the legal academy. But it was a disgrace what happened there, and I think we need to do that again this upcoming election, because ultimately, taxes matter, but ultimately it's your core values and your commitment to things like freedom and liberty. And I see a Liberal Party right now where the presumption of innocence is unheard of. We can all think, Pell, no presumption of innocence came out of the Prime Minister. Christine Holgate, no presumption of innocence. The SAS guy, no presumption of innocence. The guy who's being charged with rape. A Prime Minister ought not to, offer an apology to someone before that case is over. That's just the basic presumption of innocence we all carry in our back pocket as part of living in a great sort of culture. He doesn't put any value on freedom. He doesn't think that we should get rid of the hate speech laws. These have all come out in the response to COVID. Boris Johnson, for all his faults, deep down didn't believe that government should be locking people in their homes. And that is why Britain, it wasn't Sweden and it wasn't Florida, but they're wide open now. Now, people will go, oh, well, look at all the people who died. But if you look at Sweden, which had no lockdowns at all, their excess deaths now are the same as the rolling average between, I think it was 2013 and 19. In other words, you can't point to any excess deaths. The people who died were all going to die within the sort of period where it doesn't show up. You can't game excess deaths. We know how many people died in 2013, 14. And so there was a spike in Sweden, but when you look at 2020, 2021, it looks like it's what it would have been anyway, so, what were we doing? And every country in the world, pretty much, the excess deaths, as bad as they've been, as caricatured by the press, take you back to about the year 2006. So even at the height of the pandemic, we're getting the same number of deaths as people got back in 2006, because people get healthier. Now, I don't remember being scared out of my mind in 2006. I don't remember thinking I'm going to die when I cross the street. So all these things fed into the truckers. And Trudeau acted ridiculously heavy-handedly, but his core constituency, which are Ottawa public servants, they demanded something. And he's not very bright, and he overreacted. The Emergency Act, it's like the war. It's an updated version of the old War Measures Act. So it's meant to be there. Sorry, it's meant to be there for effectively, when the country's invaded or there's massive terrorist attacks shutting down the country. He invoked this. He didn't invoke it after 9/11. Like, this act has never been invoked, and he invoked it for a handful of truckers. To the extent they were breaking the law, it was all infringements on where you could, park your trucks and stuff. There was no violence. So this is crazy. And, he got incredibly bad press, even in the US, even in the New York Times, because it was such an incredible overreaction. They were shutting down bank accounts, seizing them, of, grandmothers who donated $30 to the truckers. So it wasn't just the truckers, it was people who were supporting them with tiny little donations. I mean, this is Venezuela. This is embarrassing. And the sad thing is, at least half of Canadians seem to think that this was great. So there's a real bifurcation in Canada. And, in my kind of job, most people in my kind of job would be on the side of the sort of Trudeau side, but I've sort of always been an outlier, and I'm very sympathetic to A, the protesters, and B, the people who supported the protesters with little amounts of money. First, GoFundMe shut it down and wanted to seize all the money and give it to left-wing charities. But they backed down to that and they gave it back. And then a Christian fundraising group stepped in and they had all their money seized. So Trudeau has, I'm thankful to say, has gone down a bit in the polls, and so has the left-wing NDP party that supported him. If you look at the left-leaning parties in Canada and the right, they sort of split 50-50 now, whereas 3-4 weeks ago, the left would have been 10-15 points up in the polls. So it's still a bit disappointing that so many Canadians support this sort of illiberal despotism, but things are better.
You mentioned, stoking unnecessary fear, and we've sort of been led by this sort of all across the Western world. I remember reading about an article where during the SARS pandemic back in the early 2000s, if media outlets stoked unnecessary fear, they were actually fined for doing so, and that was a more serious virus than the current.
Yes, I mean, it's become plain that there was a ginormous problem with the media and big tech. So to just take one example, there's lots, but take the origins of the COVID-19. In the early days, a few people, including a former head of MI5, the British MI5 or MI6, I forgot, they said, we think this came out of the lab. And if you said that, big tech censored you. And the editor of Nature refused to publish that. I mean, this wasn't the competition of ideas the way science works. This was flat out censorship. Well, the British government, as of yesterday, has said the preponderance of evidence clearly shows this came out of a lab. We've now got the majority of people who know about this stuff saying it came out of the lab. It's not. Matt Ridley, who at first said, there's no way it came out of a lab. He's the great science writer, Lord Ridley. He now says it's like 95% it came out of a lab, and he's got the evidence, and he apologized for his earlier view. He said, I got swayed by the sort of press. Now, these are two-bit little journalists who don't know. You should not be in the game of shutting down views. Or take the Great Barrington Declaration. So some of the best epidemiologists and doctors on the planet, Barrett, something Indian name from Stanford, Gupta from Oxford, somebody from Harvard, they wrote this declaration. I signed it early, but it had 100,000 signatures. We ought never to lock down. We ought to focus our protection on the vulnerable. So the idea that you're a granny killer. That's just cheap talk. Nobody ever advocated that. They advocated looking after the people who are vulnerable. So the super obese, the old, you know, the guy who, Anders Tegnell, who was the epidemiologist in Sweden, the chief epidemiologist, you know, he got just about everything right with retrospect. The guy should win a Nobel Prize. He won't, because you'd have to admit you got it wrong. The one thing he got wrong is aged care. Everyone got that wrong. Something like 40% of people who died of COVID died in old age homes, or whatever you call it, aged care facilities, whatever the jargon is. We got that completely wrong. And we partly got it wrong because, you know, take Governor Cuomo in New York. They got so frightened by the prospect of not enough beds in the hospitals, and those predictions never came true, by the way, that they started moving old people out of the hospitals and putting them into aged care. And when they did that, the old people brought with them COVID. And so it spread through the aged care. I mean, aged care facilities were like killing factories. And, you know, that was a ginormous mistake. And Tegnell says that. Now, you know, nobody did it on purpose, but the handling of this whole thing, I mean, I've predicted since the beginning that this will go down as the worst public policy disaster in all of our lifetimes. I could be wrong, but there's nothing been good about it. And so it's against that background that people protest, and the response was brutal. And luckily, it didn't last more than 2 days, because the international reaction, and he's just a two-bit little thug, Trudeau. So he's unwound it, and he's putting the money, he's unfreezing the accounts. But, you know, if this is your response to people who protest things you don't like, because when Trudeau agrees with the protesters, nothing ever happens. So it's exactly the same as in the US. You know, we had a year of Black Lives Matter protests, which were basically shutting down the center of big cities, and, you know, fires, deaths, murders. That can go on forever. But if you protest for any cause on the right side of politics, you're characterized as a neo-Nazi, revolutionary or something. And people can see the hypocrisy and the double dealing and the double standards. And one of the problems is society is cleaving apart. Is that the right word? It's bifurcating. It's very hard to deal with people on the other side. When I was growing up, I used to have arguments with people all the time. We'd go for a beer. You know, nobody thinks they've got a pipeline to God. Maybe Andrew will in the future, who knows? But nobody really thinks they have a pipeline to God in these matters, right? You don't know. But nowadays, when you're arguing, a lot of people on the other side of politics, and I think it is more a problem on the left. They seem to, if they don't agree with, they call you a racist, or they call you a Nazi. Like, you can't have a discussion with people. Once you're called a racist, you can't have a discussion with that person. And one of the big mistakes I think that people on the right do is they try to apologize when they don't feel they've done anything wrong. And there's plenty of studies that show that's one of the worst mistakes you can make. You can look at Toby Young in Britain. You know, you get sucked into thinking, okay, I'll just apologize and move on. And then you just seem to be weak. If you don't think you've done anything wrong, don't apologize. Now, I wouldn't take that advice into your marriage, gentlemen. In your marriage, definitely apologize, even though you don't think you've done anything wrong. But for life more generally, don't do it. It's a mistake. Human nature does not treat people kindly who apologize. They think they just go after you even harder. And so we've got a real problem. And one of the problems with right of center parties around the Anglosphere is our side of politics doesn't fight. You know, the ABC batters us for 5 or 6 years. So Mr. Morrison gives them more money. We'll give them $3 billion over 3 years. That's great. Okay. So what's the point? You look at appointments in Britain or Canada when Harper was there. We don't appoint conservatives to anything because, Twitter will erupt. And so we appoint the same kind of people. If you look at, who did Morrison put in to run the ABC? What's the point? Or you look at the high court judges, when you look at the Love decision, one of the worst decisions in the history of judicial activism, 3 out of the 4 in the majority were George Brandis appointees. It just beggars belief, right? And so people say, why, what's the appeal of Trump? Well, that's the appeal of Trump. He fought back. Now, is he your ideal sort of vehicle for your side of politics? No, he's not. He's not. But here's what he is. He's someone who fights back. And you have to be a particular sort of person to withstand the unbelievable abuse. Just look at the sort of abuse hurled at Trump, and look at this sort of 3-year, bogus Russian collusion allegations, which the Durham reporter is starting to show look to be worse than Watergate. What they did, and that ate up about 2 years of his administration, maybe 3. And so the average sort of right of center politician will just cave in. We know they'll cave in. They cave in on net zero. There was no, I think Morrison could have won the election fighting net zero alone, but he didn't. Why? Why did he cave in on net zero? So it makes it easier for a couple of the Sharmas and the Frydenbergs to win their seats. This is a loser strategy in the long run, my view. I'm not a god or anything, but I think you're ultimately going to find that right of center parties become the parties of the outer suburbs, the working class, people who think that their culture is a good one and they're not the most racist society on earth, because patently we're not. I've lived all over the place. Give me any woman and you tell me where outside of the West you would like to live, because the answer is nowhere. And so when we're talking about these sort of things like misogynism or something, it's always at the margins. Of course it happens. But it's against the context that this is the best place to live, basically in human history. And when I say this, I mean, Australia, Britain, the US. And if you can't see that, you're something of a moral cripple. Sure, let's talk about the problems, but it's always against the context that we have to stop educating young people as though they're living in one of the most racist, terrible societies that ever existed. It's just not true. And I don't think kids really learn how important democracy is. The surveys are terrible. I sent my kids to university in Canada. They went through schools here in Brisbane, but Canada's worse than Australia in many ways, but the universities are better. I can believe that. Now, the universities are terrible here, and there are some redeeming features. One of the redeeming features is an unintended one, and almost everywhere in the Anglosphere, the US, Britain, Canada, even New Zealand, when your kids get to age of going to university, you leave home. Like, well over half of kids go away to university in Canada, more in Britain, more again in the US, and even in New Zealand. I spent 11 years teaching at Otago. None of the students were from Dunedin. And so what happens is you get away from home, you learn to live on your own, and because you're away from home, you have, you're living with other young people, you talk, and it's just a better way to go to university. Australia has this, and I'm not against sort of utilitarian outlooks often, but it's a very utilitarian system where if you're from Brisbane, then you go to a university in Brisbane. You might go to the G8 one if you get really good marks, or you go to QUT, or you go to Griffith, or, and there's a hierarchy, but it's always a hierarchy within the city. And so University of Melbourne doesn't really compete with Sydney or UQ. And in Canada, Britain, they do compete against that. And so there's this internal competition. And so one of the benefits of our system, which I don't like at all, but an unattended benefit is loads of kids don't come to campus very often. They come in for their 2 days a week, whereas in Britain or Canada, you're on campus all the time. And that means there's some great things about that, but it also means that the lefty radical students have this sort of audience. Whereas here in Australia, there's a certain indifference because people just never really much on campus. And in a weird kind of way, that's turned out to be a benefit, unintended. But I don't like the bureaucratic, top-down Australian universities, and I think the way that they have become no-go zones for conservatives. That's another thing that's really weird. We've had 8 years of coalition government. Things are worse in the universities than they were 8 years ago. There are fewer conservatives. In 10 years, you'll be hard-pressed to find a conservative academic. There's only 2 ways to withstand the pressures, I would say. Now, I won't do a welcome to country, acknowledgement of country, because I think it's condescending, patronizing pap. Right. So I could never get a job as a dean or any in the administration. No. And if you think that affirmative action quotas are a bad idea, so you're against diversity, inclusion, equity, and those are just dressed up labels for what is in effect a quota system. Effectively, it's a sort of mild Marxist view where you look at the percentage of people in the population who have this kind of reproductive organs or this kind of skin pigmentation, and then you pick a good job And you say, well, we have to have the same percentage. Why? Why is there this equality of outcome? People are autonomous agents. They make their own choices. There's loads of evidence that women don't make the same sort of choices as men. They don't want to go and be plumbers, right, or whatever. And so this sort of group-based Marxism, where you look for quotas, it only ever applies in sort of arbitrary places. So it's maybe women on boards or good jobs. Nobody says, 92% of people who die at work are men, because men have all the dangerous jobs. So we need to put a whole bunch more women into jobs where they'll die, because that's equity. Or nobody says there's way too many, if you look at the percentage of the population that's homosexual and the percentage that works as political advisors, it's not even close to statistically. So we need to fire a whole bunch. I'm totally opposed to that kind of thinking. You don't say, if people, but that's effectively the kind of thinking that undergirds what's happening at universities with this diversity, equity. Any half-decent coalition government would shut it down tomorrow. It is just quotas, and it's arbitrary quotas based on, if you care about anything in a university, it should be having a wide spectrum or diversity of outlooks. That is shrinking by the day in our universities. The whole universities cover the entire spectrum of thinking from A to B. A being hard left and B being slightly softer hard left. And so these are big problems, and we have to stop buying into this framework of seeing the world that emerges out of the ABC. Effectively, it's diversity, equity, inclusion are just three nice words for a very bad practice. Right. Well, if you believe that the way I do, you can't get a job in administration in the university. And if you're young, you probably can't get a job in the university at all as an academic. I mean, I'm senior enough that, and I write vocally enough that my university leaves me alone completely. I have never had anyone tell me I can't do something. If they did, I'd have an article in the Australian the next morning because I'm a bit of a psycho. And I don't really, that strategy sort of works, or you can be very quiet. I mean, I know some people who are very conservative academics, and they, I know, but there wouldn't be anybody else at the university who knew. Talk about being in the closet. They're so in the closet, right? That strategy works, but I just, I wouldn't feel good about myself. But some people have to do that because they don't want to, if you're in some positions, you're not going to lose your job. But if you're a graduate student trying to get jobs, and there's all these indirect ways too. We have this bizarre focus on getting research grants, and so if you don't get research grants, they say, okay, we can't continue your employment, or you're not confirmed or whatever. So if you wanted to do a research study into how terrible Australia was in stopping the boats, you'd get a grant for sure. But if you wanted to support stopping the boats, you'd never get a grant, right? Take the entire range of conservative views and try to get a grant for any of them. Good luck. You might get a grant to study federalism, I don't know. And so the whole system is one where we should not be rewarding grant getting outside of the hard sciences. This is just me going off on my hobby horse, but when the Liberal government goes to look at universities, who do they consult with? Vice chancellors. I've been in meetings with vice chancellors. They hate conservatives. They don't vote coalition. Why are we consulting with Glenn Davis or some, vice chancellor who's, they never come and talk to the handful of conservatives who work in universities. What is Angus Taylor? What were they doing? I don't know. It boggles my mind. It's like, or they bring in a Labour-appointed Chief Justice of the High Court, French, to do a report on free speech. But, the problem isn't one of the policies the universities have. That is a problem, but it's a very lesser problem. The problem is self-censorship. The problem is hiring. The problem is people not feeling like they can say what they think. And if they do, they use the code of conduct against you. All of these are problems. And they're not problems on the papers. So we got problems across the board, but you've got to speak up and be, if you think you're right, you have to be prepared to say it and take a little bit of pushback.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more. Just pivoting slightly, from my understanding, your background, you've done a lot of research and studies on Bill of Rights. Would a Bill of Rights in Australia or Canada have any impact on solving any of the issues you've mentioned there?
Well, when you say I've done a lot of writing, I'm a complete and total Bill of Rights skeptic. My view is when you buy a Bill of Rights, you're buying the political and policy druthers of the lawyerly caste. And to put that in context, 50 years ago, and I generalize, but the lawyerly caste as a whole, the median lawyer would have been to the right of the median voter. No doubt about it. Lawyers today, that's not even close to true. The median lawyer, after these woke legal educations, the median lawyer is way to the left of the median voter. And these are the people who become lawyers and then judges. And what a Bill of Rights does is it articulates moral principles that we're all in favor of because they're couched in such amorphous general terms, like, right to free speech. Who's against that when you say it like that? I always tell my class, I'm waiting for a guy with a brown shirt and a little mustache to put his hand up and say he's against it. But even he'd say he's for it because it's framed in such general terms that everyone assumes that the right to free speech is going to deliver their view of speech or their view of freedom of, and so there's no content to them. Now, nobody can have an absolute right to free speech. I mean, I'm the most pro-free speech guy going in Australia, I think. But nobody would be in favor of, if somebody discovered how to make a weapon with things from your kitchen, just the regular ingredients in your kitchen, and that weapon could destroy life on Earth, you would not let people publish that recipe. You would never let them publish that recipe. I mean, so the absolutists on free speech, you say there should be no limits ever, they're just crazy, right? You can't publish lists of CIA agents in some country or how to make a nuclear bomb in 3 easy steps, right? But leaving aside that, I'm sort of with the American First Amendment jurisprudence. Barring incitement to violence, we live in a world where you ought to vigorously be able to disagree, and it shouldn't be a veto that, oh, my feelings are hurt. When I grew up, we were always told sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt you. I went to a tough school, and a tough sort of public school. The girls were tougher than most of the guys I meet who work in universities. I mean, if someone called you names, that was a good day. Bullying when I grew up meant these big guys came and they punched you. That's what bullying was. You got beat up. And so you learned pretty quickly that you have to stand up to bullies. You didn't expect to win, but what you did expect was to raise the costs so that the bully would pick on somebody else. So you never back down, because if you back down, the bullies just keep coming after you. So I grew up where bullying, in a tough, more at my high school, more people went to jail than university in my graduating high school class. I know what tough people are, and they don't respect the kind of sort of what has become of the Labour Party, where instead of being a party for the working class, it's become a party for sort of the human rights lawyer wing of the world. And so the problem with bills of rights is they characterize things that are highly amorphous in a way that, up in the Olympian heights of abstraction, where we're all going to put our hands up, right? Everyone's in favor of the right to free speech. But when you start going through the kinds of things that the top courts around the Anglosphere decide, so should you be able to put up a bulletin board outside of a primary school advertising smoking? Well, people disagree on that. The Canadian Supreme Court said, yes, the right to free speech did allow that. Now, a lot of us would think, no, or campaign or hate speech or campaign finance rules. And so what you effectively do is you just delegate to a bunch of top judges who are just committees of ex-lawyers, and they make all the rules down in the sort of quagmire of day-to-day detail. Now, I don't think that the judges deliver the goods. I know that when you characterize it in general terms, everyone says, of course I want the right to freedom of religion. But no judge, when you look at judges around the world and what they actually decide, freedom of religion always loses to equality rights. So that's the empirical right. We can model something else, but the data is clear. And we've seen it through COVID, what the problem with modeling is. It just isn't right. And so a Bill of Rights is effectively a highly moral enumeration of entitlements that everyone is in favor of because they finesse disagreement. They just, they exist at such a high level of abstraction. But you're not giving people an absolute right at all. You can't. because rights conflict, and nobody would want to live in a world where there are absolutely no limits on religion. My religion lets me sort of blow people up. Okay, then, no problem. Or my religion lets me smoke peyote. Okay, no problem. So there are always limits on these things, and people have to argue about where you want to draw the limits on campaign finance rules or hate speech provisions. And in my view, has always been that ought to be decided in the elected legislature, where everyone's treated equally and we all have a say. Under a Bill of Rights, all those decisions, if you look at the U.S., 25% of roughly people vote for president based on whom he will appoint to the Supreme Court. Why? Because the Supreme Court makes all the important decisions. See, why should 9 judges decide who can marry or whether you can have an abortion? These are things that we ought to be able to have a say on. And so the problem with bills of rights is they take those issues out of the democratic sphere and they hand it off to the lawyerly caste. And I wouldn't want the lawyerly caste. I used to say they were the worst group of people making decisions ever, but I've changed my mind in the last 2 years when I've seen what the public health caste of doctors and the journalists have done. I have to apologize to the lawyerly caste because actually the public health caste turned out to be the most heavy-handed, authoritarian, despotic group of people whose only focus of concern is COVID deaths, not deaths from other things, not deaths from what happens when you lock people in rooms. And so I think these are issues where, there's no obvious reason why the plumber or secretary's view on where to draw the line on hate speech provisions is any less worthy than a lawyer's or a judge's. And bills of rights inevitably, that's the point of bills of rights. They take power away from the voters and they give it to a lawyerly caste who present themselves as enunciating timeless, fundamental human rights. It makes compromise impossible. Often you need to sort of slice the baby in half. You can't do that. If you characterize an issue in terms of timeless, eternal, fundamental rights, you can't bargain that away. Right? It's not an accurate characterization, by the way. It's almost never an accurate characterization. But once you've done that, you're finished. And so I actually like the fact that Australia has no national Bill of Rights. I've been involved in all the campaigns trying to stop it. I don't like the state level of statutory bills of rights. And one thing I like to point out to people, which I did in this Spectator piece that's out 2 days ago, is when you look around the Anglosphere during COVID, and remember these were the greatest inroads on our civil liberties ever, there were no judges anywhere using the Bill of Rights to strike them down. What a surprise. Why is that? Because the judicial caste was totally in favor. They were part of the No, there were exceptions like Lord Sumption, but basically the lockdown sort of laptop class, they liked lockdowns, they liked vaccine mandates. They thought that this heavy-handedness was warranted. You're just not going to get people with that point of view in the background using a Bill of Rights to strike down the legislation. It won't happen. What you do find, if you look at what's happened in the U.S., is you get some old-fashioned administrative law. So there's quite a few state courts in the U.S. who've looked at executive actions to impose, vaccine mandates, masking mandates, and they've said, well, this executive action is not authorized by the governing statute. So, the statute will give power to maybe the minister or some body. And old-fashioned administrative law says, well, the legislature can do that, but they have to be clear and explicit. And often the statute wasn't. So you've seen a lot of those things struck down. Old-fashioned administrative law, that's much more worthy. I think if Morrison had have taken the Section 92 border challenge, they would have won. Personally, Clive Palmer spent a lot of money, and I think I would have liked to have seen it. But really, I don't blame the judges for that. If you're one of 7 high court judges and the federal government isn't prepared to argue to open the borders, well, you can't expect 7 judges to override the state and federal government during a pandemic. They won't do it. But had Morrison and the coalition fought the Section 92 case, I actually think they had a pretty winning argument. But, we'll never know.
What are the lessons that Canada or Australia can draw from the trucker protest movement?
I don't know. I mean, the politicians they don't. Well, let's look at it the other way. If it starts to appear that they massively overreacted, you just locked up people for 2 years. Can you as a politician ever admit you got it wrong? You can't really. I mean, personally, if I were a betting man right now, I'd bet that the coalition's going to lose the next election, and I've picked them to win the last few ones, even in 2019. But I just, people like me are so disgusted with the lack of sort of liberal values that, I think there'll be enough of us who bail out on them. You might get some independents in the Senate, Liberal Democrats, One Nation, the Palmer Party, might get enough of them in to have some. It's going to take 2 or 3 elections because of the way the Senate works. But, it would be nice to get a blocking group in the Senate that sort of mirrored what the Greens do for Labor. That's not going to happen in one election. But I would not be surprised if the next Liberal Prime Minister is someone who did not have any hand in all these heavy-handed lockdowns, as in wasn't in cabinet these last few years, because I think it's an embarrassment. Down the road, it'll be seen as more of an embarrassment. Some of the stuff coming out in Britain now about what SAGE did and what they knew, this is, if your goal is to set out to petrify your own population, which they did, to run daily case counts, who cares about cases, and to give no context at all. If you ask an average Australian, how many people die of the flu every year? Like, do you guys know? Pre-COVID, it was like 1,700, I think. So that's a normal flu year. That's not a bad flu year. That's a normal flu year. And nobody ever said, here's the context, here's the background, here's the age of people dying, here's where we need to focus our protection. And that's what Sweden did under Tegnell. And their results in the context of Europe are now, well in the top half of results. And they didn't lock down anything. They didn't spend anywhere near the money we spent to impoverish future generations. And I think it's pretty clear they got it right down the line. Leave aside aged care facilities. Well, I think as we start seeing, there's an awful lot of unexplained sort of extra deaths lately. They're not COVID deaths because people aren't dying of COVID right now. It's clear that people missed cancer checks. They missed people heart. There's all sorts of people are going to die of other things because of the lockdowns. But the politicians who caused this aren't going to be around then. It's going to be 3, 6, 9 years away. But I really hope that 20 years from now, we look back on these politicians, this political caste that happens to have been in office, not just here, but around the Anglosphere, and say, you really let us down. Some people say, well, they didn't know, so they went with the sort of precautionary principle, which is like zero tolerance for risk. But that's not the right default. If you don't know for sure what's going to happen, that's when your principles kick in. And your principles are, we live in a free society where people make their own choices and they change their behavior spontaneously, the way Sweden under a left-wing social democratic government did, or the way Florida did under DeSantis, who now is wildly popular. So if your default is, well, I don't know, so I'm going to act like China, that's a weird default to me, right? When I say China, I don't mean we welded people in, but we came close. Just a weird default. And, the precautionary principle is a stupid principle. The idea that you live your life and your default point of view would be to go with a path that has no risk at all. You'd never meet anyone to date. You'd never take a job. I mean, we live, life is to live, not to lock yourself in a cupboard. And so, of course, we ought to weigh risks. We ought to make the best choice we can based on the information at hand. But the idea that your default setting is go for the zero risk option, and it was only zero risk on one matrix of concern, because it turned out there's going to be massive problems on all the other matrices. It's just bad thinking. And a party that has liberal in its name ought to have read John Stuart Mill, and they ought to have had some attachment to freedom-related issues. And one of the things, with no offense to the people listening, one of the things, and I'm, again, as pro-free speech and conservative as you'll find anywhere in the university system, this party disgusts me with its total and complete lack of commitment to freedom. Now, you can say, well, Labor's worse, and they are, But anyone who studies game theory knows that that just keeps pushing you farther and farther and farther down the road. What have we done in the last 8 years that a Labour government wouldn't have been delighted to do? Well, maybe the defense arrangements, AUKUS, and then that's it. It's a disgrace right down the line. So we have to turn that around. These things happen. You can turn it around. We have to get in there and sort of get politicians. One of the things that surprises me, you get young people who go and work, and I think John Roscombe's a great man, a great Australian, and the IPA, Institute of Politics, is great. But the two people who came through that institution and got into Parliament, Tim Wilson and Patterson, have they crossed the floor on a single vote? No. Have they stood up for, have they actually walked the walk as opposed to talk the talk? No, they have not. This is the young people who actually, in the UK, in the British Parliament, 100 MPs voted against Boris in favor. So 100 MPs, 100, said, we're not voting for these heavy-handed rules. He had to get Labour support. And it was that more than anything that turned Boris around in favor of undoing the restrictions. 100. We get Craig Kelly. Good on him. And I think Matt Canavan had a good day. But the rest of our right of centre politicians, they go into Parliament and deep down they think, I'm so important that it's more important for me to stay in Parliament to fight another day than to put off my party and sort of cross the party and stand up for actual real. And you're just deluding yourself if you think you're that important. The most important thing you could have done as an MP is to stand up against these things, and they didn't do it. And they should be ashamed of themselves, in my view. And I have no confidence that the way we're pre-selecting our candidates on the right side of politics is delivering the kind of people we want in Parliament. It has become plain that both sides of Parliament are bringing people into Parliament who go to university, they join the local political party, whatever it is, the Labour, Libs, whatever. They do that at university, and then they go and work for the union, or they go and work for a think tank, or they go and work for a minister. And at some point, with their connections, they get pre-selected. Their life experiences sort of rhyme with the fifth Roman emperor, the pyromaniac. That's what their life experiences are, zero. And it would be much better if people left university, spent 10 or 12 years doing a real job. I don't mean working for Tourism Australia. I don't mean being a civil, I mean, go and work find out what it's like to actually make a living, or what it's like to work in a big firm in Toronto and London. And the answer is you work a lot. People say to me, people work so hard as academics. That's my colleagues. No, we don't. No, we don't. The one thing you can say about academic life is it's nowhere near as tough as working at a big firm or whatever. And so we're picking the wrong kind of people. And, I think they think, well, I can't afford to leave Parliament. I know that's true of Labour, but now it's becoming true of people on our side. You get these young MPs and I can't vote against my party, even though I think it's wrong, because, I need to become a cabinet minister, or I'm too important, or I can't afford to lose this job. Well, I don't want people like that in Parliament. I want someone like Churchill, who crossed the floor twice. He changed parties twice. I'm characterized as this right-wing guy, but my views line up almost perfectly with John F. Kennedy's on taxes, on everything. And so, I just feel the world's moved. I haven't moved. I have a deep, and I think you have to, if you want to fix things, you have to be prepared to stand up. So people call you names. So what?
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I've actually just realized the time. We have gone about 7 minutes over, so I'm afraid that is all we have time for. But that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Next time I'll make sure to grow a beard so I can look like you. I know this is, what do they call it? The hipster look. I don't even know what a hipster is, but I think having a beard is part of the hipster.
I hope I'm not a hipster. I hope I'm not.
do you drink macchiatos with almond milk and a little bit of...
Oh, no, please don't. Yeah, good times. Anyway, much appreciated having you on, Heather, Allan. It's been great having you.
By the way, that's my wife. I'm not transitioning.
No, honestly though, it's been fantastic, and the wealth of knowledge that's just pouring out of you. We had a whole bunch of questions, but you end up answering them all pretty much anyway. So it'd be fantastic to have you on the show in the future again, as some of these different things that
Well,
we're
let
seeing
me
would be
just say to
interesting.
your audience, you're just exhibiting the one rule in life: when someone shamelessly flatters you, you should just let them keep talking. There's a great time when somebody introduced somebody with this over the top flattery like you've just indulged in, and he got up to give his talk, and he thanked the introducer and said, I really wish my dad would have loved to have been here to hear that introduction, and my mom, she would have believed it. Anyway, thanks
Awesome.
for that.
No worries. So I've been your host, Rory O'Connor, my co-host, Andrew Cremant. This has been the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions. Thank you so much and have a good evening.